Everyone knows what happened in Genesis 3. The fruit, the bite, the fall, that's the moment. That's where it happened. That's where everything changed. Except it isn't. The bite is not where this story begins. The bite is where this story ends. And the evidence for that is right there in the text. It has always been right there in the text. The account records an entire sequence of events that happen before the hand moves, before the mouth opens, before any visible act occurs. A sequence that most people have read dozens of times and walked straight past, because everyone is watching the bite. No one is watching what the text actually records happening before it. Forensic investigators have a term for this. They call it fixation on the terminal event. The crime scene is studied, the moment of impact is analyzed, the final action is examined in precise detail, and the actual beginning, the event that made the terminal event structurally inevitable, goes unexamined because it doesn't look like a beginning, it looks like nothing. That is exactly what happened with Genesis 3. The bite looked like the event, so the bite became the story. But if you go back into the text, not to read it, but to investigate it, something else is visible, a sequence, a progression, a series of changes that occur before any action is taken, inside a space that no one was watching, building something that the bite only confirmed. The most important event in this account did not happen when Eve reached for the fruit. It happened before that, and the text records exactly when. So the question this investigation exists to answer is not what happened in Genesis 3. The question is, what happened before the bite, and why has that always been the part we miss? The first thing people misstart before the bite. Everyone starts at the bite. The investigation starts earlier. Genesis 3 doesn't open with an action. It opens with a conversation. And the first forensic question isn't what was said. It's why the conversation happened at all. Because a conversation requires two participants. The text records that there were two. That's the first finding. Before the lie, before the desire, before any visible act, there was an exchange. And an exchange required something that most readings of this account never stop to examine. Someone stayed. The woman didn't have to answer. Whatever the serpent said could have been met with silence, with departure, with the simple behavioral reality of someone who had no reason to engage. Engagement was not forced. It was not ambushed. The text records no coercion. It records a response, which means before anything else in this account, before any argument, before any reframing, before any lie, attention moved toward the conversation and remained there. That's finding 2. Now here's the question. The investigation can't skip. Why did it remain? Look at what the serpent actually opened with. Not a claim, not an offer, not a threat, a question. Did God really say? And the question was not about the garden, not about the animals, not about anything in the vast available landscape of Eden. The question was about the one boundary, the one limitation, the one instruction that defined the edge of what was permitted. The serpent opened by directing attention, specifically and precisely, at the boundary itself, and the attention went there and stayed. Here is the third forensic finding, and it's where the investigation starts to get uncomfortable. A boundary that is fully closed, a boundary that feels structurally absolute, non-negotiable, simply the shape of reality, doesn't generate a conversation. It generates silence. You don't pause to discuss the edge of a cliff as though it might not be there. You don't engage with a question about whether gravity applies to you today. Some things are not experienced as topics, they're experienced as features of existence, but the boundary in Genesis 3 became a topic. The woman engaged with the question about it. She answered, she discussed, she treated the instruction as something that could be examined, clarified, explained. And here is what the investigation has found. Nothing visible has happened yet. No action, no violation. Nothing any observer could point to, and yet, the boundary is already being treated differently than an absolute boundary is supposed to be treated, which means the investigation now has a problem, because if the boundary was already functioning as a topic, already available for discussion, for examination, for debate. Then something happened to the boundary status before the serpent spoke, before the conversation started, before attention moved, before any of this. Something had to already be true about the boundary that made it susceptible to exactly this kind of question. The investigation came looking for the beginning. It found the conversation. Then it found attention. Then it found attention, remaining at a boundary that was already open enough to be discussed. And now the investigation is looking at something it didn't expect to find. The possibility that the conversation wasn't the beginning either, that something was already underway before the first word was spoken, that what looks like the opening of the sequence was already the middle. The conversation was already the middle. So the investigation goes inside it, not to examine what was said, to examine what was happening to the person hearing it. Because something was happening, something the text records, something that should not have been possible. The investigation expected to find a lie. Instead, it found something earlier than a lie. Before the serpent made a single false claim, it asked a question. Did God really say? And the investigation expected the woman to reject the question, to treat it as irrelevant, to respond the way a person responds to a question about something that is not in question. She didn't. She answered, which means the question landed, which means something inside the certainty, before any counterclaim was made, before any alternative was offered, was already examinable. The investigation just found the first problem. Certainty that functions as an absolute doesn't engage with questions about itself. This certainty did, but here's where it gets worse. The woman quotes the instruction back, and in quoting it, she adds to it. The original says nothing about touching the tree. She adds, or touch it. The investigation has seen this pattern before. Over-clarification under pressure. Not deception, something more precise than that. Evidence of movement. Certainty doesn't elaborate when it's stable. It elaborates when it's already shifting, when it's working harder than usual to hold its own position. The certainty was shifting before the serpent made a single counterclaim. The investigation now has to ask, what was moving it? Then the counterclaim arrives. You will not surely die. The investigation expected this to fail, expected the certainty, even a slightly loosened certainty, to identify the statement as a direct contradiction of the original instruction and reject it. It didn't fail. It registered as a possibility, and that is the finding that breaks the investigation open. Because for a direct counterclaim to register as a possibility, the original certainty couldn't just be loosened. It had to have been repositioned, reclassified. The instruction had to have moved from "this is what is true" to "this is one interpretation of what is true." That shift didn't happen during the counterclaim. The counterclaim only worked because the shift had already happened. The investigation is looking for a beginning, and every time it thinks it's found one, it finds instead that something had already moved. But the investigation keeps going, because now the interpretation changes. The same tree, the same instruction, the same God. Nothing external has changed, and yet what the woman understands about all of it has completely inverted. The limitation that was a protection becomes a deprivation. The authority that was trustworthy becomes a withholder. The boundary that was a structure of relationship becomes a fence around something being kept from her. No new facts were introduced. The facts didn't change. The reading of the facts changed. And the investigation has to ask again what made that possible, what made an interpretive framework that had been stable suddenly available for replacement. Certainty shifted, but certainty shifting doesn't automatically rewrite interpretation. Something underneath interpretation had to be susceptible to a new framework before the new framework could take hold. What was susceptible? The investigation pushes further, because then the evaluation changes. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, and a delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. The tree was always those things. It was good for food before this conversation. It was beautiful before this conversation. It was associated with wisdom before this conversation. None of these are new observations, but they are producing new movement. Under the original framework, those qualities were irrelevant, visible, but behaviorally inert. Now they are evidence. Now they are reasons. The evaluation didn't change because the tree changed. The evaluation changed because the framework being applied to the tree changed. And the decision, the complete, finished, ready-to-execute decision, assembled itself out of that new evaluation before a single action occurred. The investigation has now found the full sequence inside the conversation. Certainty shifted, interpretation inverted, evaluation rebuilt, decision completed, all invisible, all interior, all prior to any visible act. And here is where the investigation runs into something it cannot explain. Every transformation it just found, every single layer of the interior reconstruction required a precondition. Certainty can only shift if something underneath it was susceptible to shifting. Interpretation can only invert if something underneath interpretation was open to replacement. Evaluation can only rebuild if something underneath evaluation was available to be restructured. The investigation mapped every change, but not one of those changes was the origin of the changes. Every layer had a layer underneath it, and the investigation has been excavating, finding certainty, finding interpretation, finding evaluation, and every time it goes deeper, it finds not the floor, but another layer of changes that couldn't have happened without something further down. What is further down? What structural condition made every single transformation in this conversation possible? The investigation has uncovered everything that changed inside the decision, and it still hasn't found what made the decision changeable. That thing is still underground, and it was there before the serpent spoke, before the conversation started, before any of this. The investigation kept digging and kept finding the same thing underneath every layer. The boundary had already stopped behaving like a wall, not broken, not removed, just different. That is what makes the discovery so unsettling. The question was never whether the fruit was tempting. The question was when temptation became possible at all. And the answer is not the bite. It is not even the conversation. It is the moment the boundary could be spoken about as if it were up for discussion. That is the hidden event. The serpent did not smash anything. It walked into a space that was already open enough to be examined. One question only works if the thing it questions has already become discussable. And once that happens, everything else starts moving. Attention stays. Certainty starts wobbling. The same facts begin to feel different. The same line begins to sound negotiable. What was once closed starts feeling reachable. That is the part no one notices until it is too late. And that is why the bite is only evidence. By the time the hand moved, the real shift had already happened somewhere invisible, somewhere earlier, somewhere quieter than the act itself. The story is not about a single bad moment. It is about the first moment an absolute stopped feeling absolute. If that happened there, where else has it happened?